it's time for some tales from the Suez, and I'm not going to dive into the recent fiasco that has rumors aplenty about what the heck happened and who's behind it and why. But I'm going to go back in time to the 1840s because this origins of this canal they're claimed on the Wikipedia and the other knowledge sources that it's in the 1800s, and I know that this thing is thousands of years old. Just like all canals all over the world, they are proof of ancient engineer master race that once dominated the earth. And Napoleon's part of the history. 1847, oh, it's possible, and then the guy does it for like a ridiculous price, and the guy's given down in history, tries to do Panama Canal, he fails, a lot of ridiculous stuff. We could dive into that, but I'm not gonna. I'm gonna do a reading from this book, I believe. I think it's this book or the other book, but some pictures will be from this book and a lot of different images and videos. I'll show you some overview of Google Earth of the canals, and you'll just be blown away. Canals are one important clue to the past, like how deep they go, who really invented them, and it was definitely by an all-connected civilization that we're told couldn't make it across the Atlantic Ocean. I don't think so. They were masters of the sea. This was a whole world that's been lost, has been just hidden from us. Someone must know, and I'm going to read a little glimpse from June 1842. So here we go, and then I'll talk about it some more and throughout. Enjoy. June 21st, 1845, visit to the Bitter Lakes Isthmus of Suez by the bed of the ancient canal of Nachos, the Khalij al-Qadim. And this is a great little overview. Just look at these canals. The canal of the Pharaohs as well, you're going to see. So here we go. It will hardly be necessary to premise that the Red Sea and Mediterranean are separated by a strip of desert about 75 miles across. The ancient kings of Egypt, struck with the vast importance of uniting the navigation of the two seas, at an early period attempted this great work. Nachos II, the Nacho of Scripture, and son of Psammetichus, after defeating the Assyrians and slaying Josiah, king of Judah, BC 610, commenced a canal that was unto the Red Sea, with the Pelusiac or eastern branch of the Nile, which communicated with the Mediterranean, almost directly north from the present Suez, near the ancient city of Pelusium. Some give it a much greater antiquity, attributing it to the great Scostrus, or Ramses III, the founder, among other vast works, of the giant hall of columns of the Palaco at Karnak, and under whose reign Egypt arrived at her zenith of power and prosperity. This canal is supposed by Herodotus to have joined the Nile near the old Bubastis, to have been filled by the water of the river, and to have been completed, or rather continued, by Darius Hystaspes. Diodorus Siculus states it to have been finished by Ptolemy II. Herodotus tells us that the first works, which cost 120,000 men their lives, were arrested in their progress by the oracle which Nachos consulted, in which declared that the canal would open Egypt to foreign invasion. Its width was calculated by Strabo at 150 feet and by Pliny at 100 feet. Herodotus informs us it was broad enough to admit two triremes to move abroadst, and that it required 4 days for a vessel to pass through it. Strabo says it was provided with water gates, locks, parentheses, and broad enough to admit ships of the largest class. Pliny calculates its depth at 30 feet. Why and when it was abandoned are uncertain. Aristotle and Pliny state that it was not opened at all in consequence of its bed being supposed to be higher than the surface of the delta of the Nile, which it was feared would therefore have been inundated by a volume of seawater from the Red Sea at Suez. The latter of these writers affirms that the canal never approached the Red Sea nearer than the Bitter Lakes, and was only 34 miles long, but the sites of Scrapium, Hierapolis, and Phagraropolis, which rose in the desert on its banks and have been attributed to the benefit resulting from its construction, indicate a much greater extent and importance, definitely. The Roman Emperor Trajan not only renewed it, but added a branch known by the name of Annus Trajanus, which, passing between Heliopolis and Babylon, joined the Nile near Memphis. It seems again to have fallen into disuse after Egypt passed into the hands of the Arabs, but was reopened by Amrou, viceroy of Egypt, by order of the Caliph Omar, in order to the better supply of the Hejaz with wheat during a famine that then prevailed in the Mohammedan Holy Land. About 134 years afterwards, it appears to have been stopped by the Caliph Mansur, with the view of cutting off the supply of provisions sent to some insurgents at Medina. This canal deviated from the course of the old one and opened on the Nile at Old Cairo, whence I traced its course about 8 or 9 miles into the desert to the northeast of the Birket El Hajj, Lake of the Pilgrim, to Mecca. Since the time of the caliphs, the canal has never been reopened. It was left for the genius of Napoleon to promulgate the idea of reviving and perfecting the great work of Sesostris and Nachos. But momentous events scaled Egypt to the comprehensive schemes for her improvement meditated by this mastermind. It remains for Muhammad Ali, who has already immortalized himself by uniting the port of Alexandria with the navigation of the Nile, in the construction of the Mohammedan Canal, to put into execution the project of Napoleon, an undertaking which, if successful, will rank high among the triumphs of human skill and labor over the obstacles of nature, and be a far more glorious monument to posterity than those useless piles of limestone, the pyramids. The port at the head of the Red Sea in the time of Ptolemy, Philadelphus, was called Arsinoe, from his sister and wife, and subsequently Cleopatris, and by the Arabs, Colzin. The ruins of the latter town, which is supposed to have occupied the site of Arsinoe, are entered immediately after quitting the northwest gate of the modern town of Suez, and consist of a number of sandy mounds occupying a space about as large as the present town, with scattered fragments of pottery, tiles, glass, and earthenware, often containing bitumen, as occurs among most of the ruins on the banks of the Nile. After passing these mounds and crossing some salt pans on the northwest extremity of the Gulf of Suez, close to the sea coast, which is here flat and sandy, the Arab guides pointed out to my fellow traveler, Captain Blogg, and myself, the embouchure of what they called the Khalij al-Qadim, which we hastened to see. It is marked by low banks of sand, the highest part of which did not exceed 6 feet in height, and ceased altogether about 50 paces from high water mark. I was unable to find any traces of banks below the water of the Red Sea, here very shallow. The banks abounded with seashells and masses of crystallized gypsum. The breadth of the bed between them was 64 paces. Diverging slightly from the seashore, we traced them in a northerly direction, varying from 4 to 6 feet in height, often interrupted and indistinct, to the camel track of the great caravan from Cairo to Mecca, where they pass round the head of the Red Sea. The surface of the country, from the commencement of the canal to this, was flat, little raised above the surface of the sea, and covered with sand and gravel. The bed of the canal was formed of the same sand, firm, and in some places moist enough to admit of the growth of a few salsolas, etc., the verdure of which, contrasted with the parched aspect of this dreary waste, over which the hot Khamsin was blowing, was by no means unrefreshing. A thermometer on the sand of the desert, exposed to the rays of the sun, sky, clear, 141 degrees. Here was observed a heap of stones which an old Arab Hajj who accompanied us said had been piled up as a landmark by the pilgrims to Mecca, to guide them to the spot where they were to round the head of the sacred gulf. These piles are called aldamat, standards or marks by the Bedouins. Near it lay the skeletons of several camels bleached by the sun, ships of the desert, wrecked in the sea of sand. The Hajj informed me that during the winter the waters of the Red Sea rise suddenly and are impelled over this wide extent of now dry sand by the violence of the southeast winds. Suez bore hence south 10 degrees west, on its right the mountains of Ataka, or Deliverance, through whose defiles the Israelites were pursued to the shores of the Red Sea, and on our left, or to the eastward, the wilderness of El-Teek, in which spring the wells of Moses, which I had visited only 2 years ago. Beyond this, the embankments of the canal are more distinct and continuous, and at about the distance of 12 miles northerly from Suez, were as perfect as if piled up a week ago, 20 feet high, formed of gravel and gypseous marl, and upwards of 70 paces apart. They become again gradually indistinct on reaching the southern extremity of the Bitter Lakes. A few low rocks of limestone break the monotony of the gently undulating desert. The surface of the bed was quite dry, but a little below it consisted of a dark, moist, reddish clay, on whose surface grew a scattered vegetation of thorny acacias, tamarisks, and salsolas. The dimensions of the lake it is difficult to ascertain, forming, as it does, but a very slight bankless depression below the level of the surrounding desert, the lowest and moistest parts being scantily clothed by the vegetation just mentioned. The surface of the surrounding track is covered by firm sand and gravel, chiefly of rolled pebbles of chert, quartz, and Egyptian jasper. In the bed of the canal and in the sand of its banks, I found in an unfossilized state many marine shells of species now existing in the Red Sea, viz. Pecten, Narantius, Murex, Scolopax, Cytherea, Calopiga, etc. Water of a saline bitter taste is found about a foot below the surface in the bed of the lakes, hence the name given them. The surface of the desert around the lakes is rather more undulating and rocky than that surrounding the head of the Red Sea, but preserves the same barren and cheerless aspect. The Arabs assured us that the same physical features prevail to the shore of the Mediterranean, where it again becomes flat and marshy. The same substratum prevails, viz. A tertiary calcareous rock, containing marino shells and corals of loose texture. Not a vestige of animal life was seen between the ruins of Kulzum and the Bitter Lakes, save the footsteps of the bird baga and the track of a hyena that had stalked across the bed of the old canal. The principal obstacles to establishing a navigable stream of water direct through the isthmus are not the shifting nature of the sands, the amount and height of rocks to be blasted, and the depth of excavation necessary. The observations of Napoleon's surveyors go to show that the extreme height of the isthmus above the sea level is but significant. The expense calculated was 700,000 pounds or something, and as to the canal being choked up by the sands of the desert, my own observations tend to prove the very trifling amount of drift that has accumulated in the old channel since the days of the caliphs. The greatest difficulty to be surmounted appears to me to be the alleged shallowness and shoaliness of the Mediterranean at the point nearest to Suez, viz. The bottom of the Pelusiao Bay, of which, in the country between it and the northernmost of the Bitter Lakes, a careful survey is indispensable. Between Suez and the southernmost of this chain of lakes, which are so favorably located for the undertaking, no greater natural difficulty exists than between Adf and Alexandria. The shallowness between the head of the Red Sea and the anchorage 3 miles off Suez would be a drawback, but one which at most could be obviated by transshipment. The present width of the channel of the old canal as far as the Bitter Lakes is more than sufficient for all purposes. It requires deepening, the banks put in repair, and fresh levels taken. The old channel, which turns off westerly at the Bitter Lakes towards the Nile, must be there deviated from, and an entirely new cut made northerly to the Bay of Pelusium. If, as has been stated, it be true that the water of the Red Sea at Suez is 32 feet higher than that of the Mediterranean at Pelusium, a current would be formed which might be turned to advantage in clearing and deepening the channel by the construction of a pier or an artificial channel of masonry at Pelusium. The difference of level of the two seas has been, by some, calculated only at 20 feet, and latterly, I understand, at 17 feet. I was informed by an intelligent Greek, Kedzi Manuli, that Suez, which stands nearly at the level of the Red Sea, is 18 feet higher than the general level of the delta of Egypt. Hence, perhaps the fear anciently prevailing of the delta being submerged by the opening of the canal. These facts, coupled with that of my having observed recent marine shells in the bed of the canal and of the Bitter Lakes, militates against the assertion of Herodotus that the former was filled with the fresh water of the Nile. It is also conclusive from this trip that the canal latterly, at all events, communicated with the head of the Red Sea. As my detention in Egypt was quite unexpected, the excursion was made without any instrument to determine the relative levels of the Bitter Lakes and that of the Suez. Judging from the flat and gently undulating character of the intermediate tract of desert, there cannot be many feet difference. That their bed is higher than the level of the Red Sea is indicated by the greater depth of the channel of the canal in their vicinity and the apparent general rise of the country. In a paper on the geology of Egypt, read before the Geological Society of London, I have shown that the shores of the Red Sea have undergone considerable elevation, and in a trip into the desert of LT, I found vestiges of an ancient beach near the head of the Gulf of Suez, left as the land was gradually elevated. That this elevation in the vicinity of Suez has been remarkably slow within the historic period is proved by the ruins of Kulzum still being washed by its tides. According to the author of the Ajij al-Makhlukat, the Red Sea was called the Sea of Kulzum from this city, which, as also that of Yemen, is mentioned as standing on the seashore. After stating that the God of glory and majesty had drowned Pharaoh and his host in this sea, he proceeds to relate a great and remarkable physical change in the features of the country, now forming its shores by the admission of the waters of the ocean. In ancient times, he says, a great space and a mountain existed between Yemen and the sea. when a prince, with the view of ruining the country of his enemy, cut the mountain for the space of an arrow's flight, and let in the sea upon the land of Yemen, the inundation acquired such force that it could not be checked. It overwhelmed many cities, and a great sea was formed, which came nigh to the land of Yemen, and extended to the cities of Judah, Yembo, Medine, Aliyah, Aqaba, the Elath of Scripture, and Kelzum. The singular gulf of the Red Sea, which Kazwini styles Shuba min Bakr al-Hind, literally a fissure in the rock where water stands or flows from the Sea of Hind, is on the line of the volcanic zone, which I have traced along its shores by Gobel Ezite, the warm springs of Tor, the semi-active island volcano Jebel Tir, through the straits of Bab el-Mubel to Aden, the existence of which is doubtless connected with the profuse growth of its submarine forests of coral. In the Bengal Asiatic Society's Journal, number 132 of 1842, I have already mentioned the possibility of the limestone beds which extend easterly from Egypt, far beyond the borders of the Red Sea, into Arabia and the Holy Land, having been once continuous, and the portion now occupied by the Red Sea having been engulfed, like the center of the Val del Bove, by a great subterraneous displacement of matter. The cliffs on each side have a singularly disrupted appearance, particularly in the Gulf of Suez. The tradition of Kazwini seems to strengthen the theory of the origin of the Arabian Gulf. The removal of the mountain which intervened between the sea, the Indian Ocean, and Yemen was probably the sinking of the lower parts of the mountain barrier of Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, by which the present narrow strait was caused, and which let in the Sea of Hind on the sunken tract now forming the bed of the Gulf, and which flowed up so far north as Kulzum and Aqaba, still at its head. So that is the conclusion of that little excerpt that I found on archive.org, which is very interesting, I think. And it tells a lot, and still at this time, it gives a glimpse into what someone there at that particular time in 1840s kind of had the idea about. Now that is no way telling of what really was there. When you look at these cities that are built with canals that are so precise, they're so straight. That overview that I did of Google Earth at the beginning, it is so precisely straight in the Canal of the Pharaohs. And if they were able to do that back in the ancient Egyptian time, able to just tear through Earth, make it perfect, build on each side, just control water perfectly, just have dominance of water because that's their highway, that's their everything. That's free energy right there with the wind. God knows they might have used stuff to power, but mostly man and wind power, and just different, probably they planned the water, the windways, the wind pathways, the currents. They probably planned everything to the point where it was so convenient, so great, so free, and so awesome. And again, I hate when people say, like, oh, Columbus was the first to discover here. Meanwhile, all these ancient cities that were built around water, like, lived on the water. Their main source of everything was from the water. Didn't somehow explore that zone. They just missed that part. Like, give me a break. A couple weeks to take to get from Europe to America? Absolutely not. They found it so many times. They knew everything. Everything has been hidden from us. Everything has been rewritten, and just garbage has been put in its place that belittles the power of the human. It belittles where we came from. It eradicates particular cultures and species of human, like giants and other beings that were probably just dominated, Tartarian, just so many different things of types of people that were just gone, and different inventions that just ceased to exist, different buildings that were masterful, just taken down, blown up, garbage put in its place everywhere, every city, all cities in America named after these same places. We have to envision what this interconnected world was like, because it's the key to what we should aim for and what we should strive for. Beauty in architecture, strength, working with nature, using forces that are free in nature, being great to one another, thinking about these angels, thinking about these miracles, these wonders, the gods, the potential, taking entheogens not like they're some drug, but like they're something sacred, exploring that world, connecting our world with it, building from it, learning from it, melding both magics together. That is where the true secret probably lies. They used everything with nature, and they were in harmony always. We need to do that again. We can. Bless you all.